Lara had always found solace by the river. Its calm, gentle flow seemed to carry away the burdens of her daily life. The rhythm of her chores, filling her water pot, gathering herbs, and tending to the small garden behind the house, had been her routine for as long as she could remember. Today was no different. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the village. Lara knelt by the water, the coolness of the river's surface gently lapping against her hands as she filled her pot. Her mind wandered, drifting from thought to thought. There was so much work waiting for her at home, so many things left to do. She sighed softly, feeling the weight of her responsibilities, but also the quiet peace the river brought her. As she filled the pot, she could hear the faint sound of rustling leaves behind her, but she didn't think much of it at first. It was only when the rustling grew louder and the unmistakable sound of paws on the earth reached her ears that she turned around. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw Rex, her old dog, approaching. Rex had been with her since she was a child, loyal and patient, his once dark coat now graying with age. He moved slower than he used to, his steps measured and deliberate. But today, there was something strange about the way he was moving. His eyes, usually calm, seemed focused on something in his mouth. As he got closer, Lara saw it, a small, lifeless form resting gently in Rex's mouth. It was barely moving. "What is it, Rex?" Lara asked, her voice a mixture of surprise and concern. She stood up and walked toward him. Rex lowered his head, placing the small form on the ground at her feet. Lara gasped when she saw what it was, a baby mermaid. Its body was tiny, its skin a soft, pale shade of blue, and its tail, once shimmering, was now limp. The mermaid's tiny body barely moved, and Lara could hear the faintest, almost inaudible sounds escaping from its mouth. Her heart raced. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She knelt beside the baby mermaid, her hands trembling as she gently touched its cold skin. Rex sat beside her, watching quietly with his usual gentle eyes, his tail wagging slowly, as though proud of his discovery. Lara's mind raced. She had heard stories of mermaids, of the mystical creatures who lived in the depths of the river, but she had never seen one before, let alone one so small and vulnerable. She quickly glanced around, trying to make sense of what had happened. There were no signs of any mermaid in distress or any other creatures nearby. It was as if the baby mermaid had just appeared out of nowhere. "Don't worry," Lara whispered softly to the little mermaid, trying to comfort it despite her own fear and uncertainty. "I will help you." She scanned the area for anything that might help her care for the creature. Her gaze landed on a cluster of herbs growing nearby. Her mother had taught her about the healing properties of certain plants, and Lara quickly gathered a handful of leaves. She chewed them gently, just as her mother had shown her, and then began applying them to the mermaid's wounds. The baby mermaid let out a soft, faint sound, but it didn't move. Lara's heart ached for it. She could feel the fragile life slipping away. She worked quickly, hoping her efforts would be enough to save the creature. The leaves were supposed to heal the wounds, but Lara knew that the mermaid needed more than just herbs. She needed warmth, care, and the love of someone who understood the pain of being alone. As she worked, Lara could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, but she didn't let it stop her. She couldn't. She had always been the one to help others, even when she herself had no one to turn to. She continued to apply the leaves, hoping that, somehow, it would be enough. A few minutes passed in silence. Rex sat beside her, his eyes never leaving the baby mermaid, as if he understood the importance of the moment. But then, as if in response to Lara's quiet prayer, the water began to ripple. Lara looked up, startled, her heart skipping a beat. She could see something moving in the distance, rising from the depths of the river. Slowly, the figure of a woman emerged from the water, her long, golden hair shimmering in the sunlight. Her tail glowed with an ethereal light, and her eyes, bright and wise, were focused on Lara. It was the Mermaid Queen. "I have been searching for my daughter," the Queen's voice rang out, clear and serene. Lara froze, unable to speak. She had heard of the Mermaid Queen, but never thought she would meet her face to face. The Queen stepped closer, her presence radiating a quiet power. "Thank you for saving her," the Queen said, her voice filled with gratitude. "She means everything to me." Lara could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had never expected this. She had only wanted to help, and now, she was standing before the Queen of the Mermaids. The Queen held out her arms, and Lara carefully picked up the baby mermaid and handed her over to the Queen. The Mermaid Queen cradled her daughter gently, her face softening as she looked at the tiny mermaid. "Your kindness is rare," the Queen said, her eyes glowing with sincerity. "It will not be forgotten." Before Lara could respond, the Queen smiled and began to sink back into the water, her body blending with the ripples as if she had never been there. Lara stood still for a moment, stunned by what had just happened. She didn't know what to make of it, but she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had done something good, something that mattered. Lara knelt down and hugged Rex tightly. "You did well, Rex," she whispered, stroking his fur. Rex wagged his tail slowly, as if he understood. He had always been loyal to her, and she had always trusted him. But Lara knew, deep down, that Rex's time was coming to an end. The old dog had lived a full life, and his body was beginning to show signs of age. A few days later, Rex passed away quietly in his sleep. Lara was devastated. The dog had been her companion, her protector, and her friend. His passing left a deep hole in her heart. One that could never truly be filled. But even though Rex was gone, his love and loyalty lived on in her memories. He had given her something precious, a reminder that kindness and love could change lives, even in the darkest of times. Lara had once lived in a home filled with warmth, laughter, and love. Her father, Mr. J, had been a hard-working man who always provided for his family, even though they didn't have much. He had married Tessa, a woman who had given him two beautiful children, Lara and her younger brother, Daniel. Tessa had been Jay's first wife, and together, they had lived peacefully in their small but cozy home. But life had a way of throwing challenges in their path. Jay's life, which had once seemed so simple, was about to be torn apart by betrayal and unfaithfulness. It began slowly, like a storm on the horizon, before it erupted into full force. Tessa had never expected Jay to stray from her. She had always loved him deeply, and she believed their love was unshakable. But Jay, for reasons Lara never fully understood, began spending more and more time away from home. He would leave for long stretches, disappearing for days without explanation. Tessa was left to care for their children, wondering where Jay had gone, what he was doing, and why he had started distancing himself from her. Lara had been only a child at the time, but even she could feel the tension in the air, a quiet, unspoken rift that was slowly growing between her parents. Jay had changed. He no longer came home with the same warmth he once had, and Tessa began to worry. It wasn't until Tessa found out about Jane, Jay's second wife, that the truth came crashing down. Jane had been the one to take Jay's attention away from his family. At first, Jane had been a quiet presence. She was much younger than Tessa, but there was something about her, a certain boldness, that made Jay gravitate toward her. Jane knew Jay was married, yet she pursued him, determined to make him hers. Tessa's heart shattered when she discovered that Jay had been unfaithful to her with Jane. But things didn't stop there. Jane became pregnant. The news of Jane's pregnancy spread quickly throughout the village, causing a stir. It was a scandal. Jay had betrayed his wife, and now he had to take responsibility. Jane's family, furious with Jay, demanded that he marry her. In a moment of desperation, Jay agreed. He married Jane, bringing her into his home, and everything changed. Tessa was devastated. The home that had once been a place of peace and joy was now filled with anger, bitterness, and resentment. Tessa and Jane could barely tolerate each other. Every conversation seemed to spiral into an argument. Tessa's heart broke each time she saw Jane in the house, taking the place that once belonged to her. But what hurt her most was that Jay, the man she had loved for so long, seemed to have abandoned her in favor of Jane. The fighting became unbearable. It seemed like every day there was a new argument, a new fight. The smallest things, who made the soup, who swept the floors, who took care of the children, became a source of contention. Tessa and Jane would scream at each other, throwing insults, pointing fingers, and accusing each other of ruining their lives. It was like a never-ending war. And Lara, only a child at the time, was caught in the middle. She didn't know which side to take, and she didn't want to be a part of the constant fighting. But it was impossible to escape. Lara's younger brother, Daniel, was too young to understand what was going on, but he felt the tension in the air. He would cry at night, unable to sleep, disturbed by the shouting from the other room. Lara would try to comfort him, but she, too, felt the weight of the situation. Their home, once filled with laughter and warmth, had become a place of sorrow and pain. One day, after months of tension, Tessa found herself standing in front of the village council, asking for a divorce. She couldn't take the pain any longer. Jay's infidelity had broken her heart, and living with Jane was unbearable. But Jay, to Tessa's surprise, refused. He insisted that he would not abandon her, but neither would he give up Jane. He wanted them both, and he didn't care what it took to keep them in his life. The next few months were a blur. Tessa tried her best to make peace with Jane, but it was impossible. The two women were too different, and their hatred for each other had only grown stronger over time. The arguments became louder, the insults harsher. Lara could feel the tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. When Lara was just 10 years old, the unthinkable happened. Tessa, Jay, and their unborn child were involved in a tragic car accident. Jay's car collided with a truck on the highway, and by the time help arrived, it was too late. Jay, Tessa, and their unborn child were all gone. It was as if the world had been ripped apart. Lara's heart shattered. In an instant, she lost everything: her mother, her father, and the family she had known. The grief was suffocating. She felt as though the world had come to a complete stop. The funeral was a quiet affair, filled with sorrow and loss. Lara stood beside her parents' graves, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe it. She couldn't comprehend how everything had changed so suddenly. Her life, once filled with hope, was now overshadowed by grief and uncertainty. After the funeral, Lara was told that she would have to live with Jane, her stepmother. The woman who had caused so much pain, the one who had torn their family apart, was now going to be her guardian. Lara's heart sank. How could she live with her mother's greatest enemy? How could she survive in a house where the woman who had destroyed everything would be in charge? The thought terrified her. She clung to the small picture of her parents, her last connection to the life she had once known. Jane's house was cold and unwelcoming. From the moment Lara stepped through the door, she felt like an outsider. Jane treated her with nothing but cruelty. Every day was a reminder that she wasn't wanted, that she was an inconvenience in the house. She was given the worst tasks: cleaning, fetching water, cooking, and always, she was last to eat. There was no love, no kindness. Jane treated her like a servant, like a reminder of the broken family she had been forced to marry into. Lara's heart ached. She missed her mother so much. She longed for the days when things had been simple, when she had a family who loved her. But now, all she had was pain and loneliness. Her stepmother's words cut deep, and every day felt like an endless struggle to survive. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Lara found herself retreating further into herself. She became quieter, more withdrawn. The bright, hopeful girl she once was seemed to disappear with each passing day. But deep down, Lara knew she had to survive. She had to find a way out of this darkness. She had to keep going, even when the world seemed to have turned its back on her. Life under Jane's roof was a far cry from the warmth Lara once knew. The walls of the house that had once echoed with laughter and the hum of daily life now felt cold and unwelcoming. It was a home, yes, but one built on resentment and cruelty. The house was never quiet. The air was thick with tension, and every corner seemed to hide some new form of misery. Lara's new reality was one filled with sorrow. She had lost her parents, and with their passing, so much more had slipped away from her: her sense of belonging, her safety, her childhood. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. Every day, she had to endure the sharp words and cruel actions of Jane, her stepmother. Jane's bitterness towards her was palpable, and she made no secret of it. She didn't care that Lara had lost everything. She didn't care that Lara was just a child in desperate need of love and understanding. To Jane, Lara was a reminder of the life she had stolen. The mornings were always the hardest. Jane would wake up early, and Lara would be expected to help with every chore: sweeping, cooking, fetching water, even cleaning the livestock pens. There was no time for rest, no time for play. The only time Lara was allowed to sit down was when her chores were done, and even then, she wasn't allowed to relax for long. There was always something else to do, something to prove. Lara had to endure Jane's harshness in silence, though it wasn't always easy. Jane made sure she knew her place in the house, at the very bottom of the hierarchy. If there were scraps of food left after the family had eaten, they would be given to Lara, but often there was nothing left for her. Her stomach would growl with hunger as she cleaned up the remnants of the family's meals, but no one cared. Sometimes, there wasn't even enough food to go around. Jane would eat lavish meals, while Lara would go without. She missed her mother, Tessa, with every fiber of her being. Her mother had been her protector, her guide, and the only source of love she had known. Lara would often find herself sitting in the corner of the yard, staring up at the sky, wishing her mother could be there to hold her, to comfort her. But now, all she had were memories of a time when the world seemed brighter, when she was a child surrounded by love. The worst part was the silence. Jane never spoke to her with kindness. There were no words of encouragement, no moments of gentleness. Instead, there were always harsh orders and insults. She would sometimes compare Lara to a servant, telling her that she was nothing more than an inconvenience in her house. At times, she would go as far as to call her worthless. "You're just like your father," Jane would say. "A burden, always expecting others to care for you." Lara's heart would shatter with each cruel remark. How could she ever fit into this new life? How could she survive under Jane's roof, knowing she was unwanted? But the answer, Lara soon realized, was that she had no choice. This was her life now, and she had to endure it. She had to survive. Despite everything, Lara still clung to a fragile thread of hope. There were days when she would sneak away to the river, the only place where she could find a small sense of peace. She would sit by the water, dipping her fingers into the cool stream, feeling the weight of the world lift off her shoulders, if only for a moment. It was there, by the river, that she felt closest to her mother. She would close her eyes and remember her mother's soft voice, the way she would sing while working in the garden, the way her hands would gently brush Lara's hair as she tucked her into bed at night. Those memories were all Lara had left of her mother, and they kept her going, day after day. One afternoon, as Lara was sitting by the river, lost in her thoughts, a thought crossed her mind. The town crier's voice echoed in the distance, and Lara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the words. "Prince Davin, the noble son of the king, is now looking for a wife. All the beautiful young women in the village are invited to the palace in 5 days." Lara's eyes widened as she heard the announcement. Her heart raced. The prince. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope. The prince was looking for a wife. Could this be her chance to escape the misery of her life with Jane? Could she, Lara, the girl who had always been overlooked and mistreated, have a chance to change her fate? The path was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the soft sound of Lara's bare feet on the dusty ground. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, her heart skipped a beat. It was none other than Prince Adari himself. Lara froze in shock, quickly bowing her head. "Good afternoon, my prince," she said nervously. Prince Adari smiled, stopping a few steps away from her. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice calm and kind. His eyes studied her, noticing how she blushed under his gaze. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lara, my prince," she said softly, keeping her eyes on the ground. "Lara," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful name. What are you doing here alone?" "I am fetching water, my prince," she answered, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The prince nodded, still looking at her. There was something about her simplicity, her gentle voice, her quiet strength. She was different from the other women he had met. "You are very beautiful," Prince Adari said suddenly, his voice sincere. Lara's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at him briefly, unsure if she had heard correctly. "I hope to see you at the palace when I am choosing my wife," he continued. Lara's heart pounded. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Thank you, my prince," she said, her voice trembling with joy. Prince Adari smiled once more before continuing on his way, leaving Lara standing in the quiet path, her heart still racing. Lara allowed herself to dream for the first time in a long while. She could picture herself in the palace, wearing beautiful clothes, living a life of luxury. She could see herself beside the prince, no longer a servant, no longer a burden. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She had nothing. No fine clothes, no jewels, no wealth to offer. She was just a poor girl, living under the roof of her cruel stepmother. How could she possibly stand a chance against the other girls in the village, all of them dressed in fine clothes, practicing their manners and speech in preparation for the event? But Lara didn't let her doubts crush her. She refused to give up. She had to try. She had to take a chance, or she would never know what might have been. For the next few days, Lara worked harder than ever. She still had to do all the chores at home, but she made time for herself, too. She would sneak away to the stream again, sitting quietly by the water, and dream of the possibility of a better life. Every day, she saved what little money she could find, hoping it would be enough to buy a simple dress for the event. But it wasn't easy. Jane saw the change in Lara's behavior. She saw the small spark of hope in her eyes, and it made her furious. Jane wasn't going to let Lara go to the palace. She would make sure of that. She hated the idea of Lara having any chance at a better life, especially at the expense of her own daughter, Myra. One evening, Jane caught Lara sneaking around the house, counting the few coins she had saved up. "What are you doing?" Jane demanded, her voice cold and sharp. Lara froze, her heart racing in fear. She hadn't meant for Jane to see her. I was just... She stammered. "You think you can go to the palace, don't you?" Jane sneered. "You think you deserve to be there, that you're good enough. Don't be foolish. You're nothing more than a servant, Lara. You belong here, with me, doing the work that I give you." Lara's eyes filled with tears, but she bit her lip to hold them back. She had no intention of backing down. "I'm going," she said quietly but firmly. "I'm going to try." Jane laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the empty house. "We'll see about that." And so, as the day of the event drew near, Lara knew she had to act quickly. She had to gather all the courage she could muster, because she was about to face the biggest challenge of her life. The day had arrived. The village was alive with excitement, as young women from all over gathered at the palace to meet Prince Davin. The streets were lined with people, their faces full of anticipation. The air was thick with excitement, and Lara felt the weight of it all on her shoulders. The prince was about to choose a wife, and every young woman in the village dreamed of being that woman. The chance to escape her life, to be free of the cruelty of her stepmother, was too tempting to ignore. Lara had spent days preparing herself. She had worked harder than she ever had, doing all her chores while keeping her goal in mind. But in the quiet moments when she could steal a second to herself, her excitement was mixed with doubt. She didn't have the fine clothes the other girls had. She didn't have jewels or silk dresses to impress the prince. She was just a girl, dressed in the same old rags, doing the best she could. The day before the event, Lara's heart sank when she saw the girls of the village preparing for the ball. They were dressed in their finest clothes, each one more beautiful than the last. Some wore gowns of fine silk, their long hair curled and styled perfectly. Others had elaborate jewelry, golden necklaces, and sparkling earrings that caught the light with every movement. They all seemed so sure of themselves, so confident. Lara, on the other hand, stood at the edge, feeling small and insignificant in comparison. But there was something about her. Something that made her different from the rest. It was her heart. It was the kindness and the purity that shone through despite the circumstances. Her eyes, though filled with sadness, held a glimmer of hope. She had the courage to dream when everything around her seemed hopeless. That was something no one could take away. On the morning of the event, Lara's heart was pounding in her chest. She had worked hard for this moment, saving every coin she could, so she could buy a simple dress. It wasn't much, but it was the best she could do. It was clean, neat, and beautiful enough to wear to the palace. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, the reality of her situation hit her hard. She wasn't like the other girls. She wasn't polished or refined. She had no family wealth or status. All she had was hope, and that didn't seem like enough. Lara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Jane's voice calling from the doorway. "Where do you think you're going, Lara?" Jane's tone was cold and sharp, full of suspicion. "You think you can go to the palace like this? You think the prince will look at you? You're nothing. Don't be foolish. Go back inside and clean the house. Don't even think about stepping foot outside this door." Lara stood frozen for a moment, feeling her heart sink. Jane had caught her. The thought of being locked away in the house, of missing this one chance to change her life forever, made her stomach twist with fear. But then, something shifted inside her. She had been beaten down for so long, been treated like a servant for so long, that now, for the first time in years, something deep within her rose up defiance. "I'm going, Jane," Lara said softly, but her voice was strong, unshaken. She didn't know how, but she would go. She would find a way. Jane's eyes widened in disbelief. "You will do no such thing," she snarled, stepping forward. "You have no place there. You're not worthy. You're nothing." But Lara, with a steady breath, turned and walked past her stepmother. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was done with being treated like a shadow. She had a right to live, to try, to fight for something better. The journey to the palace was a blur. Lara's heart was racing, her breath shallow with anticipation and fear. She knew that she had no real chance against the other girls, but she couldn't allow herself to turn back. She had to try. It was all she had left. As she neared the gates of the palace, the scene before her was overwhelming. The palace stood tall and majestic, its golden gates shining in the sunlight. The grounds were filled with young women, all vying for the prince's attention. They were laughing and talking, their voices a mix of excitement and anxiety. But Lara couldn't help feeling out of place. She had no one with her. No mother, no family. She was alone. The guards stood at the entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd as they waited for the girls to enter. As Lara approached, her heart pounded even harder. She felt all eyes on her, judging her. The guards stepped forward, their faces unreadable. "Where do you think you're going?" one of them asked, his voice stern. I'm here for the prince," Lara stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. She hadn't expected to be stopped at the gate, but the moment felt surreal. The guards looked her up and down, their eyes lingering on her simple dress and unkempt hair. She felt a flush of shame. They could see how out of place she was. "A special invitation from the prince," one guard sneered, his tone dismissive. "You look like a beggar, not a princess. Go home." Lara's heart dropped. She felt the weight of their judgment, the sting of rejection. She had hoped for a chance, but now it seemed impossible. Her dreams, her hope for something better, felt like they were slipping away. But then, something unexpected happened. A voice, calm and soothing, interrupted the moment. "I know her," came a warm voice from behind her. Lara turned around to see Prince Davin standing there, his eyes locked on her. He was tall and handsome, his royal attire fitting him perfectly, but there was something in his eyes that made Lara's heart flutter. He had recognized her. "Please, allow her to pass," he said, his voice commanding. The guards stepped aside, surprised at the prince's intervention. They didn't question him, and Lara, stunned, stepped forward, unable to believe what had just happened. "I've been hoping to see you again," the prince said softly, his gaze gentle and kind. Lara's heart soared as she gazed at him, unsure of what to say. "My prince," she whispered, her voice trembling with both excitement and disbelief. The prince smiled warmly at her. "I hope you're ready," he said. "I have been waiting to meet you." The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to make Lara's heart race. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that something had changed. The prince had seen her, had recognized her. The palace was filled with noise and excitement, its grand halls buzzing with anticipation. Music played from every corner, filling the air with rhythm and joy. Servants scurried back and forth, carrying trays of food and drink, while guests from all over the kingdom gathered in the lavish courtyard. The scent of flowers and fine perfumes lingered in the air, mixing with the chatter of excited voices. This was the day the prince would choose his wife, and every girl in the village had come with the hope of being chosen. But for Lara, the day felt overwhelming. As she walked through the grand halls, she couldn't help but feel out of place. The other girls were dressed in magnificent gowns, their jewelry sparkling in the dim light of the chandeliers. They carried themselves with a grace and confidence that Lara couldn't match. She felt small, her simple dress and unkempt hair a stark contrast to the elegance surrounding her. Yet, there was something inside her that refused to shrink away. For the first time in her life, she was in the presence of something greater than herself. She had a chance. A chance to change everything. The prince had seen her, had spoken to her. That alone made the whole experience feel surreal. But now, as she entered the grand hall, Lara knew she had to make the most of the opportunity. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she wasn't going to let fear hold her back. As the night wore on, the prince made his rounds, speaking with the girls, laughing with them, and admiring their beauty. But his eyes kept drifting to Lara. There was something about her that he couldn't shake, a quiet strength, an inner beauty that seemed to shine through the rough edges. He had seen it the moment he had met her by the river, and now, as he watched her interact with the others, he knew that she was different from the rest. But Lara wasn't the only one vying for the prince's attention. Myra, Jane's daughter, had been groomed for this moment. She was dressed in a shimmering gown, her long hair styled perfectly. She had spent days preparing, practicing how to walk, how to talk, how to smile. She was the picture of grace and beauty, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She had a plan, and it was all about winning the prince's heart. Myra was used to being the center of attention, the one everyone noticed. But she had never expected the prince to show interest in someone like Lara. It was maddening. Myra had spent her whole life being praised for her looks and manners. She had been raised to be the perfect bride for a prince, and now, here was Lara, with nothing to her name, who had caught his eye. It was an insult. Myra couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let Lara, of all people, take her place. Myra had to be the one to marry the prince. She would do whatever it took to make sure that happened. In the quiet corners of the palace, Myra began to hatch her plan. She wasn't going to let Lara steal her future. If the prince was interested in her, then she would make sure that Lara didn't stand a chance. She went to her mother, Jane, with a cold glint in her eyes. "Mother," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We can't let Lara win. She can't marry the prince. We have to stop her." Jane, who had been keeping a watchful eye on the events unfolding, nodded. "You're right. We can't let her ruin everything. I have a plan." Myra's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I'll have her removed from the palace," Jane said with a dark smile. "I'll make sure she's never seen again. And you will be the one the prince chooses." Myra's face lit up with a wicked smile. "I knew you would come through, Mother." Together, they began to put their plan into motion. Jane had connections in the palace, servants who were loyal to her and would do anything she asked. She would have Lara taken away, hidden in a place where she couldn't interfere with Myra's chances. As the evening continued, Myra and Jane worked quietly, orchestrating the events behind the scenes. Lara was completely unaware of their plan. She was too focused on the prince, too lost in the excitement of the moment. She had no idea that the danger was closing in around her. Meanwhile, the prince was becoming more and more intrigued by Lara. Every time he looked at her, he felt a pull, a connection he couldn't explain. She was different. She was kind, humble, and beautiful in a way that no amount of wealth or status could replicate. He knew that he had to speak with her again, that he needed to get to know her better. When the prince finally found her alone in a quiet corner of the palace, his heart skipped a beat. She was standing by a window, gazing out at the night sky, her eyes filled with longing and hope. "May I join you?" the prince asked softly, his voice gentle. Lara turned around, startled but pleased to see him. "Of course, my prince," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there together, looking out at the stars in silence. The prince took a deep breath, his heart racing. He had to know if what he was feeling was real. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice low. "There's something about you, something I can't ignore. I want to know more about you, Lara." Lara's heart fluttered in her chest. She hadn't expected the prince to say something like that. She had always believed that someone like him would never notice someone like her. But now, here he was, speaking to her as if she were the most important person in the room. "You have such a kind heart," the prince continued. "It's rare to find someone like you in the world today. I admire your strength and your resilience. It's something I find incredibly beautiful." Lara blushed, her heart swelling with pride and happiness. She had never been praised like this before, not in all her life. It was hard to believe that someone as important as Prince Davin could see her as anything other than just another girl from a poor family. But just as she was about to speak, a voice interrupted them. It was Myra, her face twisted with anger and jealousy. "There you are, Lara," Myra said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I was wondering when the prince would notice you. But I'm afraid your little moment in the spotlight is over." Lara turned to face her, surprised by the sudden hostility. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Myra stepped forward, a cruel smile on her face. "I think it's time for you to leave," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "You're not welcome here. You don't belong in the palace." Before Lara could respond, Myra turned to the prince, her eyes full of desperation. "You don't want someone like her, my prince. You need someone like me. Someone who is worthy of you." The prince's face hardened. He could feel the tension building between them, but his heart was already set on Lara. He turned to Myra, his voice firm. "I've made my decision," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Lara is the one I want." Myra's face flushed with rage. "You can't be serious," she spat. "You can't be so foolish." But the prince didn't listen. He reached for Lara's hand and pulled her gently toward him. "I know what I want," he said softly. "And I want you, Lara." Lara's heart soared. She had done it. Against all the odds, against the cruelty of her stepmother, against the beautiful girls who had everything she didn't, she had won. She was the one the prince had chosen. The night was electric with tension. The grand hall of the palace shimmered under the glow of thousands of candles, their light flickering in the shadows. The laughter of the guests, the music of the orchestra, and the clinking of fine glasses filled the air. But amidst all this grandeur, Lara felt a sense of calm and clarity that she had never known before. It had all led to this moment, this decision. The prince had chosen her. The weight of the world, the pain of her past, seemed to fade away as she stood by his side, her heart swelling with pride and hope. She was no longer just a servant in a cold house, she was a princess, chosen by the prince himself. Beside her, Prince Davin stood tall and proud, his gaze never leaving her. His eyes were filled with admiration and warmth, as if no one else in the room mattered. For Lara, it was a moment she had never dared to dream of, a moment that felt too good to be true. And yet, here she was, standing in the center of the palace with the prince who had seen her for who she truly was. The crowd parted as the royal priest stepped forward. His voice echoed through the hall as he asked the prince to make his choice official. "Prince Davin," the priest said, his tone respectful, "the time has come. Will you choose a wife, and unite your kingdom?" The prince nodded, his eyes still locked on Lara. The room grew silent as he turned to face the priest. "I have chosen," he declared firmly, his voice carrying through the hall. "I choose Lara." Lara's heart leaped in her chest. The moment had finally arrived, and the weight of it all almost made her dizzy. The prince had chosen her, the girl who had once been so broken, so alone. She had come from nothing, had lived a life full of pain and hardship, and now she was about to marry the prince, the future king. It felt like a dream, and yet it was real. The crowd erupted into applause, but Lara could only focus on the prince's face. The way he looked at her, with such sincerity and love, made her believe that everything she had endured in the past was worth it. This was her moment, her redemption, her victory. As the royal priest blessed their union, Lara felt a wave of emotion rush through her. She had fought so hard for this, and now, it was finally happening. The life she had always dreamed of, the life she thought was out of her reach, was now within her grasp. It was a new beginning, a fresh start. And it was all because of the prince, who had chosen her despite everything. But even as the ceremony continued, not everyone in the room shared her joy. Jane, Lara's stepmother, and Myra, her stepsister, stood in the corner, their faces dark with anger and jealousy. They had plotted, schemed, and tried to take what wasn't theirs, but now they were powerless. Lara had won. The prince had seen through their lies, through their manipulation, and had chosen her instead. Myra's face was twisted with bitterness as she watched the couple, but Jane's expression was harder to read. She had never wanted Lara to succeed. She had always seen Lara as a reminder of the past, a person who didn't belong in the royal world. But now, seeing her standing at the prince's side, Jane couldn't hide the frustration that welled up inside her. The prince's coronation was just days away. With Lara by his side, he would become king, and they would rule the kingdom together. Lara's life, which had once been filled with pain and loneliness, was now filled with love and promise. She no longer had to worry about survival. She no longer had to live in fear of her stepmother's cruelty. She had found her place in the world, and she had found love. But the road ahead would not be without its challenges. There would always be those who resented Lara's rise, those who would question her place beside the prince. But Lara was no longer afraid. She had faced too much, fought too hard, to let anything or anyone take away her happiness. The days that followed were filled with preparations for the wedding and the prince's coronation. But despite all the work, Lara never once felt overwhelmed. She was filled with a sense of peace that she had never known before. She was going to be queen. She was going to rule alongside the prince, and together, they would bring prosperity to the kingdom. As the day of the wedding arrived, the palace was adorned with flowers and ribbons, and the air was filled with the sound of joyous music. Lara stood at the entrance to the grand hall, her heart racing with excitement. She had come so far, from the depths of sorrow to this moment of pure happiness. Her dress, though simple compared to the gowns of the other women, was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. It was a symbol of everything she had endured, the hardships, the pain, the struggle, and how it had all led to this moment. The prince stood waiting at the altar, his eyes fixed on her as she walked down the aisle. The moment their gazes met, Lara knew without a doubt that this was where she was meant to be. She had found her home in his eyes. The ceremony was brief, but it was everything Lara had ever dreamed of. With the prince's vows, with his words of love and devotion, Lara knew that she had found her place in the world. She was no longer the girl with nothing, the girl who had been cast aside and forgotten. She was the queen of the kingdom, loved by the prince, and surrounded by the people who admired and respected her. After the ceremony, the entire kingdom celebrated. The streets were filled with music and laughter as people danced and sang. Food was passed around, and the people of the kingdom rejoiced, knowing that their future was bright with the new queen and king at the helm. But even in the midst of the celebration, Lara never forgot where she had come from. She never forgot the struggles that had shaped her, the pain that had forged her into the person she was. She had never let go of the kindness and humility that had defined her. And as the night wore on, she knew that her journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, but she would face them with the same strength and grace that had brought her this far. Lara had found her happiness, but more importantly, she had found her worth. She was no longer defined by her past. She was the queen, the wife of the prince, and the ruler of the kingdom. And with her heart full of love, she stepped into the future with hope and confidence, knowing that the life she had always dreamed of was now a reality.